So my granddaughter Lily decided to stay in here today to listen to me. She'd never heard Papa preach, and I think she really understood what I did for a living. Yesterday we were up at we stopped by the office, and I had my key in the door, and what were you saying, Lily? Like, are you sure you should be here? So yeah, I have keys to all the doors. So there were two friends that met one day on the street, and one looked very sad, and he was like almost crying, and the other man said, "Hey, friend, how come you look like the whole world is just crashing in on you? What's the matter?" And the sad fellow said, "Well, let me tell you. 3 weeks ago, one of my uncles died, and he left me $50,000. Well, that's not bad. That's okay. Hold on, not finished. I'm just getting started. 2 weeks ago, a cousin I never knew kicked the bucket and left me $95,000 tax-free dollars. Wow, that's great. I mean, I'm sorry for your loss, but I would like that to happen." And he said, "Wait a minute. Last week, my grandfather, he passed away, and I inherited $1 million. And the guy was like, "Well, then why are you so glum?" And he said, "Well, this week, nothing." In a couple of our readings a moment ago, we heard a little criticism about greed. In the gospel reading, in response to a dispute over two brothers' inheritance, Jesus said, "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then we heard from the writer of the letter to the Colossians, who said, Put to death whatever in you is earthly, including greed," which the writer says is idolatry. Now, although greed is not a crime in our society, and it is usually only chastised in its most extreme forms, we do need to be reminded on occasion that despite what Gordon Gekko proclaimed in the movie Wall Street, greed is not good. Although in many ways greed is the fuel that runs our economy, we should agree with Erich Fromm, who famously said, "Greed is a bottomless pit which exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy the need without ever reaching satisfaction." Now, typically when preachers decide they want to talk about greed, they address it from a spiritual angle and talk about it from that perspective, and that's certainly part of what I want to do this morning. But I want to begin by talking about it from a scientific, if not biological, angle. I'm not sure we can locate it, but I'm convinced there must be, in the human species, a greed gene. A greed gene. And to illustrate this, I am going to tell you a monkey story. Have you ever heard how some monkeys are captured so that they can spend the rest of their lives in zoos? Here's what happens. A shining metallic object is placed in a long-necked jar tied to a tree. And as monkeys swing through the trees, eventually their eyes will catch a glimpse of the reflection of the sun on this shining object. Reaching into the jar poses no problem for the monkeys. But when they try to grab a hold of that object and they try to bring their closed fist through the narrow opening, they can't make it. To gain their freedom, all they would have to do is let go of that worthless object. But instead, they sit by the jar, holding on to that object until their captors come and take them away. What this illustrates to me is that greed is a natural phenomenon. All animals exhibit greed because out in the wild, greed is a must for survival. They have to be greedy in order to eat and procreate. because they are in competition with one another for these things. Darwin's survival of the fittest really means survival of the greediest. And if our closest biological relatives, the primates, exhibit such blatant greed in nature, then it stands to reason that we humans also possess something that we might call a greed gene. Primates are naturally greedy, and as you know, we share well over 90% of our DNA with our primate cousins, and I think we can draw our own conclusions from that. We can also talk about this in the sense of a hoarding instinct. Talking about a hoarding instinct. This is a basic instinct that we find in all animals. Stephen Vander Wall wrote the definitive book on this called Food Hoarding in Animals. And of course, the classic example is the squirrel that hides the nuts that he finds and that throughout the winter so he can be fed. Now, they aren't the only hoarding animals out there. Wildcats often bury small prey, such as birds. Moles store up earthworms in mounds. Foxes might store eggs or bones in shallow holes. Mice scatter and hoard seeds and nuts in underground nests. And if animals hoard, you can bet that people do as well. And I'm not just talking about people who suffer from an extreme compulsive hoarding disorder, the kind of people that we saw on that television show a few years ago called Hoarders. Did any of you watch that? I was always captivated by that show, because I've had a couple of people over the years in my congregations that had a severe hoarding problem. But many people hoard things, not to that extent, but many people hoard things out of what we call, or what they believe is necessity. And sometimes we refer to this as the Depression-era mentality, which of course developed during and after the Great Depression. And we have all had people in our family that accumulate and keep almost everything because of this hidden fear they have that all of that will someday go away because of what we went through in the Depression. So that tight uncle you might have, or that sister who is very frugal, they might be showing signs of a Depression-era mentality. Now, of course, being frugal is not always the same thing as hoarding. And hoarding does not always equate to being greedy. And yet we are talking about the same family of human activities. Some of these activities are extreme, although most are not. But I assume that all of us fall on that spectrum at one place or another. So my argument this morning is that we are all greedy to one degree or another, even if we aren't particularly frugal, and even if we don't necessarily hoard things, we are all greedy because we're human. So is greed, here's a question, is greed a product of nature, or is it a product of nurture? That is, do we learn it sometimes for very practical reasons like mere survival, or is it something we inherit and it's part of our DNA? Is it possible, in other words, that there is a genetic component to greed? Are we born with a greed gene? So in recent years, there have been a couple of different studies conducted and pretty much doing the same thing. And both of these studies found that the income potential for identical twins has a higher correlation than income potential for fraternal twins. How many of you are fraternal twins or have a twin? Yeah, a couple of you, a few of you. Have any identical twins out there? Identical twin, okay. So the studies show that the identical twins, there's a higher connection, a correlation between them than there are between fraternal twins in terms of income potential. In other words, there seems to be a genetic component at play here. And so the researchers concluded that it is quite possible that a tendency, wherever we are on the spectrum of greed, that it's inherited, that there is that possibility that's something we inherit. Of course, if there is a greed gene, if it's within us, some people have a stronger gene than others. Some of us have the dominant gene, and some of us might have a recessive gene or whatever. In an article written about the studies that I just mentioned, the author, a college professor, wrote this. He said, "Take me, for instance. IQ tests say I'm smart, and personality tests say I am conscientious. But money doesn't matter much to me. When someone leaves academia to earn 5 times the income I make, I don't feel envious. I feel relieved not to be leaving academia. The end result, while I'm financially comfortable, I earn a lot less than many people with similar intelligence and work ethic." And then this writer goes on to ask that if intelligence and conscientiousness account for a portion of one's income potential, how much, he asks, could be measured by the greed factor? And why do some people seem to have it more than others? Okay, so what does all this mean? As I've already said, I believe this gives us an insight into greed as a natural phenomenon. It is part of nature, it's who we are. But that's not really the problem. The problem is, why do we see greed in the human species exhibited at extreme levels? It may be part of nature, but why do we see it at extreme levels in humanity? If greed evolved through the various animal species as a mere survival technique, then why do human beings show the tendency to do more than just survive? Where did we get that? Why do we do that? Now note that in the main character in Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 12, what we have here is a rich man who had already produced abundantly. He was already wealthy. He is in no danger of not surviving. And yet, it's not enough. This reminds me of John D. Rockefeller's response to a reporter one day asking him the question, how much money does it take to satisfy a person? He asked Rockefeller. And the billionaire spoke back and said, always a little more. Always a little more. So the rich farmer in Jesus' parable had an interesting dilemma. He had too many crops and not enough storage. So he decided to build bigger barns. I mean, who could argue against that strategy? That's just common sense, right? You got to do something with it. And furthermore, there's no indication that the farmer is a bad man, that he's cheating anyone, that he's breaking the law. As I said earlier, greed is not against the law. And yet, according to Jesus' parable, God does not have a favorable impression of this rich farmer, to say the least. And here's a question. Why do you think Jesus is telling a story about a rich and greedy farmer to what is almost certainly a poor and needy group of peasants? Because that's what most people were back then, people that Jesus spoke to. Why is he telling this parable to these poor peasants? Isn't he preaching to the choir, so to speak? Wouldn't there have been a lot of amens coming from the crowd? A lot of soak the rich comments? Well, not necessarily. And I'll tell you why. Poor people are just as greedy as rich people. That's right, I said something politically incorrect. Poor people are just as greedy as rich people. The difference is rich people have more opportunities to be greedy. We could find any number of random poor people on the streets, and we could give them a very large winning lottery ticket, and then we could sit back and watch in amazement as the greed gene takes over their minds and bodies and their souls. Since greed is a natural part of our humanity, just as it is for monkeys and squirrels, it's not going to go anywhere. Preachers can talk about it all we want. It's not going anywhere. We can detest it when we see a CEO making 400 times the amount of an employee working for the same company makes. We can rail against greed when we see personal yachts that are over 500 feet long. We can decry the growing accumulation of wealth in the hands of the notorious 1%, while the middle class continues to disappear. But at the end of the day, all of us will desire to have more tomorrow than we have today. We would all jump at the chance to build bigger barns. Along the way, however, we need to be a little more evolved than monkeys. And we need to educate ourselves about the economic disparities and injustices that are an unfortunate byproduct of our way of life, because it is. And awareness breeds action, action breeds change. And even if we are influenced by our greed gene, perhaps we can do our best to allow our other genes a chance to grow and prosper and bring a sense of balance to our lives. We don't have to let our unevolved animalistic side get the better of our more evolved spiritual side. So let the shining object go. Set yourselves free.